March 15, 1944. 20 miles west of Tokyo, inside a nondescript concrete building surrounded by barbed wire and armed sentries, Commander Atsuzo Kurihara sat alone in his cramped office, staring at a stack of paper transcripts illuminated by a single desk lamp. The hour was late past midnight, and outside the windows of the Owada Communications Unit, Japan's premier signals intelligence facility, the night was silent except for the distant hum of radio receivers operating in adjoining rooms. Kurihara's third cup of bitter green tea had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the phonetic notations his team had painstakingly transcribed from intercepted American Marine Corps transmissions, emanating from the Marshall Islands, where fierce combat raged between Japanese defenders and American assault forces. For 18 consecutive hours, Kurihara and his hand-picked team of Japan's finest cryptanalysts had been attempting to decode what appeared to be tactical military communications, voice transmissions that preceded American attacks with eerie consistency. The sounds coming through their sophisticated receivers defied every analytical technique in their considerable arsenal. These weren't the random atmospheric noises that sometimes plagued radio intercepts. The pattern unmistakably suggested structured military communication, precise timing that preceded American artillery strikes and amphibious assaults, duration consistent with operational orders and battlefield coordination, frequency usage matching known Marine Corps protocols. Yet the language itself remained utterly, maddeningly impenetrable, unlike anything catalogued in their extensive files on Allied communication systems spanning 3 years of war. Kurihara rubbed his tired eyes and listened once more to the wax cylinder recording his technicians had captured. The sounds that emerged from the speaker seemed to flow with linguistic structure, rising and falling in what might be sentences, punctuated by what could be words, yet entirely alien to his trained ear. Bizad, Dahi, Shiel. These syllables meant nothing, connected to nothing in his mind, despite his facility's extraordinary track record. This moment, this frustration, this complete cryptographic failure represented something unprecedented in modern military intelligence history. What Kurihara could not have known, what no Japanese intelligence officer would comprehend until years after the war's end, was that he was listening to the only unbroken code in modern military history, a code that would remain secure not for weeks or months, but for the entire duration of the Pacific War. Before we continue deeper into this remarkable World War II story, if you're fascinated by untold stories of the Second World War and love exploring military history documentaries that reveal the hidden dimensions of WWII history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. Now, let's journey back to understand how this unbreakable code came to exist. Because the story doesn't begin in the Pacific Theater, and it doesn't begin with military strategists or cryptographers. It begins centuries earlier, in the American Southwest, in a land of red mesas and vast desert skies, where a people had preserved something more valuable than they could have imagined. The Navajo people, or Dine as they call themselves, had inhabited the high desert plateau of the American Southwest for centuries, their ancestral lands spanning what would become the modern states of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. By 1940, approximately 170,000 Navajo people lived primarily on a reservation covering 27,000 square miles, the largest Native American reservation in the United States. Their language, Dime Bizad, belonged to the Athabascan language family, a linguistic group that had migrated from the far north centuries before, establishing themselves in the Southwest through a remarkable cultural adaptation. The Navajo language was, from a linguistic perspective, extraordinarily complex and utterly unique among world languages, possessing characteristics that had evolved over millennia of geographic isolation and cultural development. To understand why this language would prove militarily invaluable requires understanding its fundamental structure, which differs radically from European, Asian, and most other world languages. Navajo is fundamentally verb-centered, meaning that actions, not objects, form the core of linguistic expression. A single Navajo verb can contain information that would require an entire sentence in English, incorporating subject, object, tense, aspect, mode, and various qualitative distinctions through an elaborate system of prefixes, suffixes, and stem changes. The possible combinations of these verbal elements number in the millions, creating a linguistic complexity that native speakers master intuitively, but that outsiders find nearly impossible to penetrate. This agglutinative nature, where meaningful elements combine to form complex words, meant that Navajo could express intricate military concepts with remarkable efficiency and specificity. The language employs 4 distinct tones: high-low, rising, and falling. And these tones completely alter word meanings in ways that have no parallel in English or Japanese. A single word pronounced with different tonal patterns might mean entirely different things: an animal, a color, an action, an abstract concept. A slight mispronunciation doesn't simply produce a recognizable error, it renders the entire utterance incomprehensible, producing what sounds like nonsense to native speakers. For Japanese intelligence officers, whose native language possessed only 5 vowel sounds and no tonal distinctions comparable to Navajo, accurately hearing, much less reproducing, these phonemic contrasts was virtually impossible. The phonology of Navajo includes sounds absent from Japanese, English, and most world languages. Ejective stops, where air explodes using the glottis rather than the lungs. A voiceless lateral fricative that sounds like wind whistling through clenched teeth. Glottalized sonorants where the throat constricts in ways unfamiliar to non-Navajo speakers. Nasalized vowels that require precise control of airflow through nose and mouth simultaneously. For speakers of Japanese, a language with relatively simple syllable structure and limited phonemic inventory, these sounds existed outside the boundaries of their auditory perception, quite literally unhearable as distinct linguistic elements. Even highly trained Japanese linguists, men who had studied at American universities and spoke fluent English, found themselves unable to distinguish between Navajo sounds that to native speakers were as different as the letters A and Z. This linguistic fortress, built not through human design, but through centuries of cultural evolution, would prove to be an insurmountable barrier to Japanese military intelligence. Philip Johnston understood this linguistic fortress's potential military applications because he occupied an almost impossibly rare position. He was one of fewer than 30 non-Navajo people worldwide who could speak the language fluently. Born in 1892, Johnston was the son of a Protestant missionary who had established his ministry on the Navajo reservation in the late 19th century. Young Philip grew up immersed in Navajo culture at a time when such immersion was extraordinarily unusual for white Americans. By age 9, he was translating his father's sermons from English to Navajo for the congregation. By 15, his linguistic abilities had brought him to national attention, and he traveled to Washington to serve as translator for Navajo leaders meeting with President Theodore Roosevelt, an experience that impressed upon him both the sophistication of the language and the marginalized position of its speakers in American society. Johnston's life had taken him away from the reservation into military service during World War I, engineering work in Los Angeles, and various business ventures, but he never lost his connection to the Navajo language or people. In December 1941, as America reeled from the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and plunged into war against Japan and Germany, Johnston read a brief newspaper article about Army units experimenting with Comanche speakers during training exercises in Louisiana. The article mentioned that Native American languages might prove useful for battlefield communications because potential enemies were unlikely to understand them. Johnston recognized immediately that this concept, while promising, had been implemented in limited fashion. The Choctaw had indeed served in World War I as code talkers, their language used for tactical communications on the Western Front, but those efforts had been improvised, limited in scope, and never formally systematized into a true military code. Johnston envisioned something far more revolutionary: a formal, comprehensive military code based on Navajo that would be simultaneously unbreakable by enemy cryptanalysts and practical for the rapid communications demands of modern mechanized warfare. The Navajo language's complexity, its complete unfamiliarity to Japanese and German intelligence services, and its oral tradition that emphasized precise memorization made it ideal for this purpose. Moreover, the Navajo population was large enough to provide sufficient recruits while remaining small enough that virtually no outsiders knew the language. On February 28, 1942, Johnston arranged a meeting with Major General Clayton Vogel, commander of the amphibious corps headquartered at Camp Elliott near San Diego, California. Johnston brought with him a carefully prepared demonstration that would change the course of Pacific War communications. The demonstration Johnston arranged was remarkably effective, though it involved just 4 Navajo men he had recruited from the Los Angeles area. men who had left the reservation seeking work in the city. Before a group of skeptical Marine officers, Johnston explained his concept, while the 4 Navajo speakers demonstrated their language's speed and complexity. Marine officers provided typical military messages, operational orders, casualty reports, and tactical updates. The Navajo speakers encoded these messages in their language, transmitted them across the room, and decoded them back into English. Marine communications officers timed the transmission against standard military encryption procedures. The results were startling. Messages that required 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode using the military's standard M209 cipher machine were completed in 20 seconds using Navajo. The messages were letter-perfect in accuracy, demonstrating that this wasn't simply quick communication but reliable communication. General Vogel, impressed by the demonstration and aware of the desperate need for secure battlefield communications in the Pacific, immediately authorized a pilot program. He requested permission to recruit 30 Navajo men for specialized communications training. The Marine Corps, facing brutal island-hopping campaigns where radio security could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat, approved the experimental program with unusual speed. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo recruits were sworn into the United States Marine Corps at Fort Wingate, New Mexico, near the eastern edge of the Navajo Reservation. These 29 men, whose names would eventually be inscribed in history, came from across the vast reservation, representing different clans, different communities, different experiences of what it meant to be Navajo in 1942 America. Among them were Chester Nez, whose family raised sheep in the traditional way near Chilchilta, New Mexico. Carl Gorman, who had attended the Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles and worked as a silkscreen artist. Lloyd Oliver, a former student at the Fort Wingate boarding school. John Benelli, whose family maintained traditional ceremonies and spoke little English at home. These men ranged in age from their late teens to early 30s. Some had attended government boarding schools where speaking Navajo had been strictly forbidden and harshly punished, where children were beaten for using their native tongue, where the explicit goal was to, in the infamous phrase, kill the Indian and save the man. Others were traditional sheep herders who had rarely left their ancestral lands and had limited experience with the white world beyond the reservation's borders. They were joining a military that officially regarded them as less than full citizens, in states where they could not vote, where hotels and restaurants routinely refused them service, where discrimination was legal and commonplace. At Camp Elliott, these 29 men were isolated in a locked, heavily guarded building for 8 intensive weeks, working to create something that had never existed before, a comprehensive military code within their native language. The task before them was intellectually monumental. They needed to develop terminology for military concepts and technologies that had no equivalents in traditional Navajo culture. They needed to create an alphabet system that would allow the spelling out of technical terms, proper names, and place names. They needed to ensure the entire system was memorizable because written codebooks risked capture. And they needed to ensure the code was expandable, capable of incorporating new terminology as military technology and tactics evolved. The original 29 approached this challenge through cultural logic and linguistic creativity that demonstrated the sophistication of Navajo thought. For military equipment, they used descriptive metaphors drawn from the natural world that Navajo people knew intimately. A submarine became Beshlo ironfish, a creature swimming beneath the surface like the fish in reservation streams and rivers. A battleship was Loso whale, the ocean's largest and most powerful creature. Fighter planes were Dahi-Tahai, hummingbirds, small, fast, darting through air with incredible agility. Bombers were Jaysho, buzzards, large birds circling high before descending on their targets. A destroyer was Kalo, shark, a predator of the seas. Tanks were Chedagahi, tortoise, armored creatures moving across land. Each term made intuitive sense to Navajo speakers while remaining completely opaque to outsiders. The alphabet required special creativity because it would be used constantly for spelling technical terms, place names, and proper nouns. To prevent frequency analysis, the cryptographic technique where analysts identify patterns by noting which letters appear most often, each letter needed multiple Navajo equivalents that code talkers would randomly alternate. The letter E, most common in English, received 4 alternatives: G, Alk, Aji, Ana, I, and Sa, needle. The letter A received 3: Wolachi, ant, B lasana, apple, and C nil, axe. The letter T received 4 alternatives, ensuring that even repeated letters in English words would sound completely different in Navajo transmission. This built-in randomization meant that even if Japanese cryptanalysts somehow identified individual word patterns, the underlying letter patterns would remain undetectable. The original 29 developed 211 initial terms covering military units, equipment, geography, tactical concepts, and common operational vocabulary. They drilled endlessly, memorizing every term perfectly because no written materials could be carried into combat. In battle, a code talker who forgot a term or made an error could cost lives, could reveal American positions, could compromise entire operations. Chester Nez, in his later memoir, recalled the weight of this responsibility. "We drilled endlessly," he wrote. "Hour after hour, day after day, we tested each other until the code became second nature. A mistake could cost lives, American lives, Marine lives. In our culture, words have power. Speaking correctly wasn't just military necessity, it was sacred obligation. Every word we transmitted carried the weight of our brothers fighting beside us." This blending of military duty and cultural reverence gave the code talkers a unique perspective on their mission. They weren't simply using their language as a tool. They were deploying something sacred for a profane purpose, using words their grandmothers had taught them to direct artillery fire and call in airstrikes. The code's first operational test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific Theater, a brutal 6-month campaign that would determine whether America could halt Japanese expansion. 15 code talkers landed with the 1st Marine Division on those contested beaches, part of the 11,000 Marines tasked with seizing the island from entrenched Japanese forces. The Japanese command had expected the invasion through their successful decryption of Allied communications. Japanese intelligence had been reading American diplomatic traffic, British naval communications, and various military codes throughout the early war years. Their cryptanalysts at Rabaul and other intelligence centers had become accustomed to understanding American intentions before attacks materialized. But suddenly, as Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence officers found themselves listening to transmissions they could not comprehend. At Japanese 8th Fleet headquarters in Rabaul, the major Japanese base in the Southwest Pacific, intelligence officers scrambled to understand these new transmissions. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, who had been educated at Stanford University before the war and spoke fluent English, personally monitored the intercepts. His report to his superiors captured the frustration that would characterize Japanese intelligence efforts for the remainder of the war. "The sounds are structured like language," Yamada wrote. "They display consistent patterns suggesting grammar and syntax. The timing correlates with American tactical movements. But the language matches nothing in our extensive files. Not English, though English words occasionally appear. Not French, Dutch, Spanish. Not any Philippine dialect, though we've considered Tagalog and Ilocano. Not any Chinese dialect, though we've consulted experts in Mandarin, Cantonese, and numerous regional variations. The language is completely alien to our analysis." The Japanese response was systematic and increasingly desperate. They assigned their top cryptanalysts, men who had broken the most sophisticated Allied codes, exclusively to these mysterious transmissions. They recorded hundreds of hours of communications on wax cylinders, creating an archive for repeated analysis. They applied every analytical technique in their considerable arsenal: frequency analysis, pattern recognition, linguistic comparison, even musical analysis examining tonal patterns. They consulted university linguists, anthropologists who had studied in the United States, even Buddhist monks who studied ancient and obscure languages. Nothing worked. Every analytical approach failed. Every hypothesis proved wrong. The transmissions remained impenetrable. On November 8, 1942, during heavy fighting on Guadalcanal, code talker Chester Nez transmitted artillery coordinates that destroyed a Japanese machine gun nest that had been pinning down an entire Marine platoon. The transmission lasted 14 seconds, brief enough that Japanese direction-finding equipment couldn't pinpoint the sender's location. Japanese intelligence intercepted the transmission, added it to their growing archive of incomprehensible recordings, but could extract no meaningful intelligence. Within minutes of Nez's transmission, American artillery shells fell precisely on target, eliminating the machine gun position and allowing the Marine advance to continue. This pattern, rapid transmission followed by immediate tactical action, repeated itself countless times throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. For Japanese commanders, it was like fighting an enemy who could read their minds while remaining completely invisible themselves. Colonel Haru Okonoma, intelligence officer for the Japanese 17th Army defending Guadalcanal, wrote in his after-action report a passage that captured Japanese frustration and growing concern. "The Americans have deployed a communication system that defeats every attempt at decryption," he noted. "Our most experienced cryptanalysts cannot identify even basic patterns. We can no longer anticipate American attacks through signals intelligence. We cannot redirect our forces effectively. We are fighting blind while the enemy sees clearly. This represents a fundamental intelligence failure that threatens all our operations." But Japan possessed one potential advantage, one possible key to unlocking these mysterious transmissions. Private First Class Joe Kayumiya, a Navajo soldier serving in the United States Army, had been captured at Bataan in the Philippines in April 1942. During the disastrous American defeat that saw 70,000 Allied troops surrender to Japanese forces. Kayumiya, fluent in Navajo though educated in English at boarding schools, was transported to various prisoner-of-war camps where he endured the horrific conditions that characterized Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners. When Japanese cryptographers began intercepting Navajo transmissions months later, intelligence officers immediately saw Kayumiya as their potential solution. They transferred him to the Ofuna Interrogation Center near Yokohama, a facility where prisoners deemed to possess valuable intelligence were subjected to intensive interrogation and torture. They brought Kayumiya before their equipment and played him code talker recordings, demanding translations. What the interrogators didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that Kayumiya heard Navajo words arranged in combinations that made no sense. The turtle is attacking the iron fish. The hummingbird carries eggs. These weren't translations of military operations. They were the code itself, a system Kayumiya had no knowledge of because it had been developed after his capture. When he couldn't translate the transmissions into meaningful military intelligence, interrogators accused him of lying, of protecting American secrets, of deliberately withholding information. The torture escalated systematically over months. Water torture, where interrogators forced water down his throat until his stomach distended painfully. Beatings with bamboo rods that left him bruised and bleeding. Hanging by his arms for hours until he lost consciousness. In the winter of 1943, they forced him to stand naked in snow until his feet froze to the ground, causing permanent damage. They starved him to 90 pounds, offering food only in exchange for translations he couldn't provide. Through everything, through unimaginable suffering, Kayumiya could only repeat the truth that his torturers refused to believe. He understood individual Navajo words but not their military meaning because he didn't know the code. A Japanese intelligence report from May 1943, discovered in archives after the war, documented their continuing frustration. The prisoner appears to be native to the mystery language, based on his recognition of individual sounds and words, the report noted. However, he cannot comprehend messages or provide useful translations. Assessment. Either the prisoner possesses extraordinary resistance to interrogation, or the enemy employs a specialized code within the native language, requiring specific training that this prisoner lacks. Recommend continuing interrogation while also pursuing other analytical approaches. The second assessment was precisely correct. Even fluent Navajo speakers who hadn't received code talker training couldn't understand military transmissions because the code added an entire layer of encryption within the language itself. Kayumiya survived 3.5 years of captivity, enduring conditions that killed thousands of Allied prisoners. His inability to help his captors, rather than being seen as proof that he lacked the knowledge they sought, convinced Japanese intelligence officers that they faced something unprecedented, a communication system so sophisticated that even native speakers required specialized training. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence largely abandoned attempts to decode Navajo transmissions, concluding that the resources required exceeded any potential intelligence gain. This decision represented an extraordinary admission of defeat by what had been one of the world's most successful signals intelligence organizations. The success at Guadalcanal led to immediate expansion of the Code Talker program. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, who commanded the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, wrote an enthusiastic endorsement that circulated throughout Marine Corps' command. "The Navajo communicators have proven invaluable in our operations," Vandegrift reported. "Their transmissions are faster than any encoding device we possess. The code has proven absolutely secure despite heavy Japanese signals intelligence efforts. I recommend immediate expansion and incorporation into all Marine divisions. A formal Code Talker school was established at Camp Pendleton in California, processing new classes every 8 weeks. Each class received the same intensive training as the original 29. 8 weeks of isolated instruction, memorizing hundreds of code terms, drilling under simulated combat conditions. By war's end, between 375 and 420 Navajo Marines had served as Code Talkers, distributed across all 6 Marine divisions fighting in the Pacific. The training at Camp Pendleton was unlike anything else in Marine Corps' history. Recruits practiced in soundproof booths, while instructors introduced battlefield noises through speakers. Explosions, gunfire, screaming, chaos. They transmitted messages while wearing gas masks to simulate chemical warfare conditions. They ran obstacle courses while transmitting coordinates, to test their ability to maintain accuracy under physical exhaustion. They worked rotating shifts around the clock because in combat, communications never stopped. The psychological pressure was immense because every trainee understood that errors in combat would cost American lives. Thomas Bega, who enlisted at 15 by lying about his age, described the training's intensity years later. "They pushed us beyond what seemed possible," he recalled. "We transmitted until our voices gave out, then kept transmitting. We memorized until terms appeared in our dreams. Lives depended on our accuracy, on our speed, on our ability to function when exhausted, terrified, under fire." The instructors were Marines who had seen combat. They knew what we would face. They didn't let us quit because quitting in battle wasn't an option. This training created Code Talkers who could function under conditions that would break ordinary communicators, men who could maintain perfect accuracy while shells exploded around them, while casualties mounted, while battles hung in the balance. The code evolved continuously as the war progressed and military technology advanced. New weapon systems required new vocabulary. The atomic bomb, though its existence was highly classified, was eventually coded as Aishi metal egg, a term that captured both its spherical shape and metallic composition. Kamikaze pilots, Japan's desperate suicide attackers, became Nat-ai death wind, warriors carrying death on wind. Each edition followed the same cultural logic that had guided the original 29. Metaphors drawn from nature and Navajo experience that made intuitive sense to native speakers while remaining incomprehensible to outsiders. By mid-1944, the code vocabulary had expanded to over 600 terms covering everything from amphibious assault tactics to close air support procedures to complex naval gunfire coordination. By mid-1943, as American forces prepared for the massive Central Pacific offensive that would carry them across thousands of miles of ocean toward Japan itself, Japanese intelligence had dedicated substantial resources to one final desperate attempt at breaking the code. The Imperial Navy's 4th Section, responsible for signals intelligence, assigned 30 cryptanalysts to work exclusively on Marine Corps transmissions. Captain Yoshiro Tanaka, who led this effort, tried innovative approaches that went beyond traditional cryptanalysis. He ordered musical analysis examining tonal patterns, hoping to find mathematical relationships. He obtained ethnographic recordings of various Native American languages from academic sources and German allies, comparing them to intercepted transmissions. He consulted with Japanese scholars who had studied anthropology in America before the war. They developed special recording equipment that could slow transmissions without distorting pitch, hoping that reduced speed would reveal hidden patterns. They created visual representations of sounds using primitive oscilloscopes, looking for geometric patterns in the waveforms. They applied statistical analysis to sound frequencies, hoping mathematics might reveal what human ears could not detect. Lieutenant Commander Masao Yamada, who participated in these analytical efforts, revealed in post-war interviews what little they had discovered. "We identified certain patterns," he admitted. "We could recognize probable call signs based on transmission length and position within communication sequences. We noted correlation between message length and operation complexity, with longer messages typically preceding major assaults. But without understanding individual words or grammatical structure, these observations provided minimal tactical value. We might deduce that a major operation was imminent, but not its target, timing, or nature. We were receiving intelligence that told us only that something was happening, never what was happening." This admission captured Japanese intelligence's fundamental failure. They had achieved pattern recognition without achieving comprehension. Japanese military forces received explicit orders to capture Marine communication personnel alive, to seize any code-related equipment or materials intact. Rewards of 10,000 yen, equivalent to 10 years' salary for an ordinary soldier, were offered for capture of code talkers or their equipment. Several close calls occurred throughout the war's Pacific campaigns. At Saipan, a Japanese patrol got within 50 yards of a code talker position before being driven off by Marine defenders. At Peleliu, a code talker named Samuel Billison was nearly captured when Japanese troops overran his position, escaping only because his partner provided covering fire while Billison destroyed his equipment and withdrew. But no code talker was ever captured with his equipment intact, and the security protocols ensured that even if captured, a code talker carried nothing written that might compromise the system. The Central Pacific Campaign, beginning in November 1943, demonstrated the code talker's strategic importance in the largest amphibious operations in history. At Tarawa in November 1943, 6 code talkers maintained communications through 76 hours of brutal combat on a tiny atoll where Marines and Japanese forces fought in hellish conditions. Lloyd Oliver transmitted continuously for 48 hours, coordinating naval gunfire support from battleships and cruisers offshore, while Japanese artillery and small arms fire turned the beach into a killing ground. His voice, transmitted in Navajo, directed massive 16-inch guns onto Japanese positions with precision that would have been impossible using conventional encoding methods. During the Marianas Campaign in summer 1944, 24 code talkers operated around the clock on Saipan, one of the war's bloodiest battles. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Hirakawa, a Japanese intelligence officer who had successfully decoded conventional American communications to anticipate the invasion, found himself blind once Marines landed. He later wrote, "Tactical intelligence disappeared completely. We could no longer anticipate American movements." Commanders felt abandoned, operating without the intelligence advantage they had come to depend upon. At Peleliu in September 1944, one of the Pacific War's most controversial and costly battles, code talker Jimmy King transmitted for 6 consecutive hours during a major Japanese counterattack after his radio partner was killed by mortar fire. King coordinated artillery fire from 3 separate Marine battalions, sending 40 messages without a single error while under direct fire, with Japanese troops sometimes visible less than 100 yards from his position. His transmissions directed American artillery onto Japanese positions with such accuracy that the counterattack was broken, saving the Marine line from being overrun. For his actions, King received the Silver Star, though the citation couldn't mention the Code Talker program because it remained classified. But the battle that truly demonstrated the Code Talkers' indispensable contribution came at Iwo Jima in February 1945, perhaps the most iconic battle in Marine Corps' history. Major Howard Connor, 5th Marine Division Signal Officer, coordinated the entire initial assault through Navajo Code. 6 code talkers working in 3 two-man teams maintained continuous communication throughout the invasion's critical first 48 hours, the period when American forces were most vulnerable to Japanese counterattack. General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, commanding Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, had spent 2 years transforming the 8-square-mile island into an underground fortress with 11 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of reinforced positions. His defensive strategy relied heavily on intelligence, on intercepting American communications to anticipate attacks and trigger precisely timed counterattacks that would maximize American casualties. This strategy failed completely because of 6 Navajo Code Talkers. Over the first 48 hours of the Iwo Jima assault, those 6 men sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. They coordinated 30,000 Marines landing on hostile beaches, naval gunfire from more than 100 ships, close air support from carrier-based aircraft, enemy position reports, medical evacuations, supply requirements, and tactical orders, all transmitted in Navajo while under constant Japanese artillery and mortar fire. The island's black volcanic sand provided no cover, and code talkers worked in exposed positions because radio antennas needed height for transmission. They transmitted while wounded, while exhausted, while watching fellow Marines die around them. Major Connor's testimony before a military review board after the battle became legendary in Marine Corps' history. "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima," he declared. During the first 48 hours, the most critical period when American forces were establishing the beachhead, I had 6 Navajo radio nets operating around the clock. They sent and received over 800 messages without an error, without a compromise, without Japanese interference. The entire operation's success hinged on communication security and speed. The Code Talkers provided both perfectly. Artillery requests completed in 20 seconds through Navajo transmissions would have taken 30 minutes using conventional encryption. That difference, that speed, meant the difference between destroying Japanese positions before they could fire and losing American positions to Japanese artillery. Those 28 minutes we saved on every transmission saved hundreds of lives. Colonel Shigeo Hayashi, Kuribayashi's intelligence officer, reported to his commander that American codes remained unbreakable throughout the battle. His frustration mirrored what Japanese intelligence officers had experienced since Guadalcanal. They could hear American transmissions. They could record them, but they couldn't understand them. For Kuribayashi, whose defensive plan had assumed Japanese intelligence superiority, this represented a catastrophic failure. His carefully planned counterattacks, intended to trigger when American forces were most vulnerable, couldn't be timed effectively because he couldn't understand American intentions. His forces fought courageously, inflicting 27,000 American casualties, including 7,000 deaths, but they fought without the intelligence advantage they had expected. At Okinawa, the war's final and bloodiest battle, beginning in April 1945, 35 Code Talkers coordinated the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. 183,000 American troops landing over 82 days of savage combat. Japanese forces, recognizing their inability to decode Navajo transmissions, attempted new countermeasures. They tried jamming American frequencies with noise and music, but Code Talkers simply shifted to alternate frequencies. They attempted voice mimicry, with Japanese soldiers who spoke some English trying to imitate Code Talker transmissions, hoping to insert false orders. Lieutenant Hiroshi Miyamoto's attempts to mimic Navajo produced what Code Talker Alfred Newman later described as sounding like someone gargling while trying to talk, completely unconvincing to any Navajo speaker. On August 14, 1945, Code Talker Teddy Draper Sr. transmitted perhaps the war's most significant message: Nihima Adejini Adanil, Japanese surrender. The message went through Navajo channels before conventional diplomatic communications, a fitting end to the Code Talkers' war. For the Navajo Marines who had spent years transmitting messages that directed death and destruction, this final transmission carried profound relief. The language that had been used to call artillery fire and direct bombing raids could finally be put to its traditional purposes: prayer, ceremony, healing. After Japan's surrender, as American occupation forces moved into the defeated empire, military interrogators made discovering the full extent of Japanese intelligence efforts a priority. What they learned shocked even experienced intelligence officers. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, who had served as Japan's chief of military intelligence, admitted in debriefing sessions that captured the magnitude of Japanese failure. "We never broke the Marine Code," Arisue stated. "We broke Army codes through cryptanalysis. We broke Air Force codes. We read diplomatic traffic. We had significant success against most Allied communications. But the Marine Tactical Code, the communications used by frontline units during combat operations, remained completely secure throughout the entire war. We never achieved even partial breaks that might have provided tactical intelligence." Captain Yosuji Kawamoto, who had led much of the analytical effort, was even more specific. "We recorded thousands of transmissions over 3 years," he revealed. "Our best linguists studied them intensively. We consulted experts in linguistics, anthropology, ethnography. We applied every analytical technique available. Nothing worked. Not frequency analysis, not pattern recognition, not tonal analysis. The code represented our greatest cryptanalytic failure of the entire war, more frustrating than any other Allied system because we couldn't even identify the basic linguistic family." In 1944, Japanese analysts had finally noted tonal patterns suggesting indigenous American languages, a belated recognition that came far too late. They had requested assistance from their German allies, hoping that German ethnographies who had studied Native American tribes might provide insight. But wartime communication difficulties, Germany's own military collapse, and German ignorance of obscure American indigenous languages prevented any breakthrough. Colonel Masao Yamada admitted in post-war interviews what this intelligence failure had cost Japan. Our inability to read Marine communications cost thousands of Japanese lives, he stated. Every Marine operation after 1942 was essentially a mystery until it began. We couldn't anticipate landing sites, timing, or force composition. We prepared defenses without intelligence, fought battles without understanding American intentions. It was like boxing a superior opponent while blindfolded. Major Hiroshi Tanaka, who survived Iwo Jima's slaughter and was captured on Okinawa, described the psychological impact. We couldn't understand their words, he explained. Technically, that shouldn't have mattered because we couldn't read their conventional codes either. But there was something profoundly unsettling about hearing human voices transmitting information we couldn't even identify as language. It made us feel primitive, defeated intellectually before being defeated militarily. The technological war we understood, the industrial war we anticipated. But this linguistic warfare, where they possessed communication capabilities we couldn't even comprehend, revealed how completely we had misunderstood America's strengths. The war's end brought victory for America and liberation for millions. But for the Code Talkers themselves, returning home carried profound complexities that would haunt many for decades. The program remained classified, designated for potential use in Cold War conflicts where secure communications might again prove decisive. Code Talkers returned to the Navajo reservation and to American cities unable to discuss their service with anyone, their families, their communities, even other veterans. They had participated in history's largest military conflict, had contributed uniquely to Allied victory, had served with distinction in the world's most elite fighting force, yet they carried their service in silence, bound by military secrecy and security classifications that wouldn't be lifted for more than 20 years. They returned to an America that had not changed in their absence, despite the profound changes the war had brought globally. They returned to states where Native Americans still could not vote, where New Mexico and Arizona denied Native Americans suffrage until 1948, where Utah maintained voting restrictions until 1957. They returned to towns where hotels displayed signs reading "No Indians Allowed," where restaurants refused them service, where employment discrimination was legal and commonplace. They were heroes who couldn't reveal their heroism, warriors who had helped secure freedom for millions while being denied full citizenship themselves. The painful irony was lost on no one who understood their service. These men had used the very language that government boarding schools had tried to eradicate, the language for which they had been beaten and punished as children, to defend the nation that had sought to destroy that language. Chester Nez, last survivor of the original 29 Code Talkers, captured this burden in his memoir published late in life. "We were warriors who helped win the war, but we couldn't tell anyone what we had done," he wrote. "We had transmitted messages that killed thousands of enemy soldiers. We had coordinated attacks that destroyed ships, aircraft, fortifications. We had used our sacred language, the language our grandmothers taught us, the language that carried our prayers and ceremonies, to direct death across the Pacific. The burden was heavy, made heavier by the silence we had to maintain. When we returned home, people asked what we had done in the war. We could only say we were radio operators. That was true but incomplete, and the incompleteness felt like dishonesty. Many Code Talkers found healing through traditional Navajo ceremonies that the same government that had drafted them had once tried to outlaw. The Enemy Way ceremony, performed for returning warriors, purified participants from warfare's spiritual contamination. Dan Aki, one of the original 29, explained the ceremony's importance in reconciling their wartime service with traditional Navajo beliefs. "We had used our language, which is sacred, to direct death," Aki said. "In Navajo belief, contact with death, especially violent death, creates spiritual imbalance that must be addressed. The ceremonies helped restore harmony. They reminded us that our language remained sacred despite how we had used it in war. They helped us understand that we had acted to protect our people, which is a warrior's duty, but that protection required purification afterward." The spiritual dimension of Code Talker service, rarely discussed in military histories, was central to how these men understood their experience. They existed at the intersection of two worlds: the modern military world of mechanized warfare and technological killing, and the traditional Navajo world of spiritual balance and harmony with nature. Using their sacred language as a weapon of war created tensions that conventional military debriefings couldn't address and that only traditional ceremonies could resolve. For years after the war, Code Talkers participated in these ceremonies, seeking to restore the balance their service had disrupted, to heal wounds that were spiritual rather than physical. In 1968, after 23 years of classification, the Code Talker program was finally declassified. The decision came as the military concluded that changing technology, particularly satellite communications and computer encryption, had made the Navajo Code obsolete for future conflicts. The first public recognition came modestly in 1969 at a 4th Marine Division reunion in Chicago, where Code Talkers were honored before an audience that finally learned what these quiet, unassuming men had accomplished. The response was emotional. Marines who had fought in the Pacific without knowing how their communications remained secure learned for the first time about the Code Talkers who had been working beside them. Many wept openly, embracing the Navajo veterans they hadn't fully appreciated during the war. National recognition built gradually. President Ronald Reagan, himself a World War II veteran, declared August 14, 1982, the anniversary of Japan's surrender, as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. The proclamation acknowledged both their military contribution and the cruel ironies of their service, that they had defended freedom while being denied full participation in American democracy, that they had used a language the government had tried to destroy to help win the war, that they had served a nation that had confined them to reservations and denied them basic civil rights. But the most significant recognition came on July 26, 2001, when President George W. Bush presented Congressional Gold Medals, Congress's highest civilian honor, to the original 29 Code Talkers in a ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda. Only 5 of the original 29 survived to attend the ceremony: Chester Nez, Lloyd Oliver, Alan Dale Jr., John Brown Jr., and Joe Palmer. The other 24 had passed away in the decades since the war, many having lived out their lives without receiving public recognition for their service. President Bush's speech captured what the nation had finally come to understand about the Code Talkers' contribution. Today we honor 29 Native Americans who, in a desperate hour, gave their country a service only they could give, Bush declared. These young Navajo men created the only unbroken code in military history, turning their native language into an unbreakable weapon of war. They served with distinction, with honor, with perfect fidelity. They helped secure victory in the Pacific and demonstrated that America's strength comes from its diversity, from the unique contributions that different communities bring to our common defense. Chester Nez, speaking for his fellow Code Talkers, responded with characteristic humility. "We were ordinary men given an extraordinary task," he said, his voice quiet but firm despite his advanced age. "We used our sacred language to help win the war because we were asked to serve our country. We were Marines first, Code Talkers second. What we did for America, the same America that had not always treated us well but was still our home, still worth defending. We hope our service demonstrated that Native Americans are and have always been loyal citizens, ready to defend this nation even when that nation had not fully accepted us." While Navajos are most famous as Code Talkers, a fuller accounting of World War II's linguistic warriors reveals that 14 other tribes also contributed their languages to secure military communications. Choctaw speakers had pioneered the concept during World War I, transmitting messages on the Western Front that German intelligence couldn't decipher. In World War II, 17 Comanche Code Talkers served in Europe, landing at Normandy on D-Day and fighting across France into Germany. Hopi, Cherokee, Lakota, Sioux, Chippewa, Creek, Seminole, and others contributed their languages in both European and Pacific theaters. The 2008 Code Talkers Recognition Act finally acknowledged all tribes whose languages had served in American military operations, awarding silver medals to Code Talkers from these other nations. John Brown Jr., a Navajo Code Talker who received his gold medal in 2001, observed the painful irony with bitter clarity. "They told us our language was no good, that it was primitive and savage, that speaking it was a mark of backwardness," he said. "They punished us in boarding schools for speaking the language our parents taught us. They tried to make us forget we were Navajo. Then the war came, and suddenly they needed that same language. Suddenly it wasn't primitive or savage. Suddenly it was valuable, sophisticated, necessary. They needed it to win the war, and we gave it to them because we were Americans, and America needed defending." But the contradiction, the reversal, revealed something ugly about how this country had treated Native peoples. The Code Talker story demonstrates Native American languages' sophistication in ways that academic linguistics alone could never accomplish. Code Talkers modernized Navajo in real time, creating grammatical constructions for concepts that had never existed in traditional culture, adapting metaphors for military purposes that Navajo-speaking sheep herders from the 1800s couldn't have imagined. The language's agglutinative nature, where meaningful elements combine to form complex words, allowed code talkers to express ideas efficiently that required lengthy explanations in English. What required entire paragraphs in conventional military communications became brief Navajo phrases transmitted in seconds. Dr. William Morgan, a linguist who studied Navajo for decades and worked with code talkers after declassification, noted what their service revealed about indigenous languages generally. They proved that indigenous languages aren't primitive relics of a pre-modern past, Morgan stated. They demonstrated that Navajo could express anything from traditional ceremonies to modern mechanized warfare with equal facility. The code talkers showed that Navajo possesses the complexity, flexibility, and expressiveness of any language on Earth. They created new vocabulary using traditional linguistic patterns, proving the language's vitality and adaptability. This wasn't preservation of a dead language. It was evolution of a living one. The Navajo Code introduced a concept that would influence post-war intelligence operations: cultural encryption, security derived from linguistic and cultural barriers rather than mathematical complexity. Traditional codes rely on mathematical operations that can theoretically be reversed through sufficient analysis. The Navajo Code added cultural barriers that no amount of mathematical analysis could overcome. Understanding required not just decryption but cultural knowledge, linguistic immersion, and oral tradition that couldn't be acquired through study alone. This concept influenced Cold War intelligence planning, where cultural and linguistic diversity became recognized strategic assets. The principle remains relevant as quantum computing threatens to break mathematical encryption methods that currently secure everything from banking to military communications. The code talkers proved that human linguistic capability, cultural knowledge, and diversity represent security resources that technology cannot replicate or overcome. Colonel David Hatch, who evaluated historical cryptographic systems for the National Security Agency, observed the Navajo Code Talkers achieved something unique in cryptographic history. A code that was never broken, never compromised, never even partially penetrated despite intensive enemy efforts. They proved that human linguistic and cultural capabilities could exceed mechanical encryption security. In an era where we rely increasingly on mathematical encryption vulnerable to future computing advances, the code talker example reminds us that human diversity itself provides security that mathematics cannot match. In the 1980s, as diplomatic relations between the United States and Japan matured and scholarly exchange increased, Japanese researchers began examining their intelligence failures with remarkable candor. Professor Tetsuo Yoshikawa, studying wartime cryptanalysis at Tokyo University, revealed the full extent of Japanese efforts in a 1987 paper. 30 cryptanalysts worked exclusively on Marine Corps transmissions for more than 2 years, Yoshikawa documented. They consulted linguists from multiple universities including Tokyo Imperial University, Kyoto University, and Waseda University. They examined ethnographic recordings and consulted what limited literature existed on Native American languages. They developed sophisticated recording and analysis equipment specifically for these transmissions. The resource commitment was extraordinary, yet they achieved nothing. Captain Minoru Yamada, a retired intelligence officer, explained in interviews what had baffled Japanese analysts. "We knew by late 1943 that the language was Native American," Yamada revealed. The tonal patterns and phonetic characteristics suggested indigenous American origin. But we couldn't identify which specific language from among hundreds of possibilities. Without knowing which language, we couldn't find speakers, dictionaries, or grammatical descriptions that might have provided entry points for analysis. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Fukumoto, another Japanese intelligence veteran, admitted the conceptual blindness that had prevented Japanese success. Using a native language as military code was so simple, so elegant, that we never seriously considered it, Fukumoto said. We expected mechanical encryption, mathematical codes, complex systems requiring equipment and training. We were prepared for technological sophistication. We weren't prepared for linguistic sophistication used as a weapon. Our failure was partly technical but mostly conceptual. We couldn't break what we couldn't imagine. In the 1990s, photographer Kenji Kawano, a Japanese American, documented the remaining Code Talker survivors in a powerful photographic project. Kawano's exhibitions in Tokyo and Hiroshima introduced Japanese audiences to the Code Talker story, creating unexpected connections between former enemies. The exhibitions drew large crowds and extensive media coverage in Japan, where many people learned for the first time about the Navajo Code and Japanese intelligence's complete failure to break it. The response was respectful, acknowledging both American ingenuity and Japanese defeat without defensiveness. Code talker Albert Smith traveled to Japan for one exhibition opening, meeting Japanese veterans who had fought in the Pacific. The encounter was emotional for all participants. "We were both warriors," Smith told a Japanese audience through translators. "My language helped defeat you in war. But language can also build bridges. Now our languages help us understand each other, help us remember the cost of war, help us work for peace." The Japanese veterans, many elderly and frail like Smith himself, bowed deeply in respect, a gesture acknowledging both his service and his willingness to engage with former enemies. In 2010, the Japanese Association of Intelligence Studies held a symposium examining cryptographic failures during World War II. Admiral Hiroaki Arbi, a senior defense official, delivered keynote remarks that captured Japanese military and academic thinking about the Code Talkers. "The Navajo Code represents perfect encryption," Arbi stated. Imperial Japanese forces possessed Asia's most sophisticated intelligence capabilities. We had broken codes from multiple nations. Yet we were completely defeated by Navajo Marines using their native language. This failure teaches humility about intelligence capabilities and respect for cultural diversity as a strategic asset. The Americans weaponized their diversity while we emphasized homogeneity. That difference mattered militarily and still matters today. Chester Nez, last of the original 29 Code Talkers, died on June 4, 2014 at age 93. His passing was marked by national media coverage, military honors, and tributes from presidents, military leaders, and Native American communities. His funeral at the Santa Fe National Cemetery drew thousands, including Marines from across the country, who came to honor one of their most distinguished brothers. The military ceremony was followed by traditional Navajo ceremonies that reflected Nez's dual identity, Marine and Dine, warrior in both worlds. Today, as of 2025, only 2 verified Code Talkers survive from approximately 400 who served: Thomas H. Begay and Peter MacDonald, both in their late 90s, neither from the original 29 but crucial to the Code's operational success. Both continue speaking when health permits, traveling to schools and military installations, sharing their experiences with younger generations who live in a vastly different America than the one they were born into. Peter MacDonald, speaking at age 96 during a 2023 interview, reflected on what the Code Talkers represented. "We showed that America's strength comes from diversity, from the unique contributions different communities bring to our common endeavors," MacDonald said. "Our different languages, cultures, and perspectives don't weaken us. They make us stronger, more creative, more capable." The Code Talkers proved this in the most demanding test possible: warfare against a determined, sophisticated enemy. We won partly because we were diverse, because we could do things homogeneous societies couldn't imagine. The Navajo language, once systematically suppressed through boarding school policies designed to eradicate Native American cultures, is now recognized as strategically and culturally important. Federal funding for Native American language preservation explicitly references the Code Talker story as evidence of indigenous languages' value beyond cultural heritage. Young Native Americans study ancestral languages with new pride, understanding that these languages represent not just tradition but capability, not just the past but potential futures. Language revitalization programs across the Navajo Nation and other tribal lands draw inspiration from the Code Talkers' demonstration that traditional languages remain vital and valuable. Dr. Jennifer Nez Dinetdale, a Navajo historian and descendant of Code Talkers, observed how the Code Talker story transformed Native American self-perception and outside perceptions. The Code Talkers transformed how Native Americans see themselves and how America sees Native Americans, Dinetdale stated in a 2019 interview. "They proved our languages aren't museum pieces to be preserved out of sentiment. They're living, evolving, sophisticated communication systems capable of expressing any human thought or need." They showed that being traditionally Navajo and being fully modern aren't contradictions but complementary identities. Young Navajos today grow up knowing their ancestors' language helped win World War II. That knowledge changes how they see their heritage and themselves. The strategic implications extend beyond World War II history into contemporary security discussions. As artificial intelligence and quantum computing advance, the code talker example of cultural encryption, of security derived from human diversity rather than mathematical complexity, gains new relevance. Some security theorists propose that future encryption might incorporate linguistic and cultural elements precisely because these resist technological attacks in ways mathematical codes cannot. The code talkers demonstrated a principle that remains valid. Human cultural diversity represents a strategic resource that homogeneous adversaries cannot easily counter. The Navajo Code Talkers achieved what might be military cryptography's most remarkable feat, creating and maintaining a code system that defied the determined efforts of one of history's most sophisticated intelligence organizations for the entire duration of a global war. Between 375 and 420 Navajo Marines served as code talkers, transmitting tens of thousands of messages without error under the most demanding combat conditions imaginable. They'd participated in every major Marine Corps campaign in the Pacific from Guadalcanal through Okinawa, from 1942 through 1945. Their transmissions coordinated amphibious assaults involving hundreds of thousands of troops, directed naval gunfire from hundreds of warships, called in close air support from thousands of aircraft, and transmitted tactical intelligence that shaped battlefield outcomes. The deeper significance lies beyond military statistics in what the code talkers represented, what their service revealed about America itself. Young American Indians used their native language, the same language that government policies had systematically tried to eradicate through boarding schools and forced assimilation, to defend the nation that had oppressed them. They came from communities marginalized in American society, denied basic civil rights including voting, yet they provided capabilities that sophisticated allies with far greater resources couldn't match. They served in a segregated military in a nation that had confined their people to reservations, yet they served with distinction, courage, and perfect fidelity. Japanese intelligence failure wasn't merely tactical defeat but represented fundamental blindness about America's nature. Japanese military planners had prepared extensively for American industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and mathematical codes. They had studied American military doctrine, analyzed American tactics, and successfully penetrated many American communication systems. But they hadn't prepared for American diversity, for the strategic advantages that came from incorporating communities with unique linguistic and cultural capabilities. The languages and cultures they couldn't access, that existed outside their frame of reference, that their homogeneous society couldn't easily comprehend, these became weapons they couldn't defend against. The empire proclaiming racial superiority and championing ethnic homogeneity was defeated, partly by the diversity it dismissed. Lieutenant General Arisue's admission that Japanese intelligence never cracked the code used by the Marines throughout the Pacific War acknowledged more than cryptographic failure. It acknowledged the challenge of confronting an opponent whose greatest strengths came from sources that Japanese ideology couldn't accommodate. The code talkers embodied an America that Japan's worldview couldn't comprehend, a nation drawing strength from diversity, incorporating marginalized communities as full participants and transforming cultural differences into strategic advantages. The code talkers proved that America's greatest strength wasn't industrial capacity alone, though that mattered tremendously. It wasn't technological superiority alone, though that provided crucial advantages. It was human diversity itself, the ability to incorporate different peoples, languages, and cultures into a unified national effort while preserving and utilizing their distinct identities and capabilities. Linguistic variety, cultural differences, and ethnic diversity became strategic advantages rather than weaknesses to be eliminated. The Navajo language that boarding schools had tried to destroy became the key to Pacific victory. The warriors that American society had marginalized became indispensable to military success. Today, as the last code talkers pass from living memory into history, their legacy endures in ways both tangible and intangible. The language that was once forbidden in government schools is now taught with pride across the Navajo Nation. Native American veterans are recognized and honored for serving at the highest per capita rates of any ethnic group in American military history. The principle that diversity strengthens security rather than weakens it has become accepted doctrine in military and intelligence communities. Tribal languages, once dismissed as primitive, are studied by linguists as sophisticated communication systems worthy of preservation and respect. The voices that spoke Navajo across Pacific battlefields during humanity's largest war carried a message that transcended their immediate tactical purposes. They announced that America's strength comes from many voices, from peoples and languages united in common purpose but strengthened by their differences rather than diminished by them. The unbroken code proved that differences aren't weaknesses to be suppressed or eliminated, but strengths to be celebrated, preserved, and deployed in defense of freedom and human dignity. The Japanese intelligence officers who failed so completely to break the Navajo Code perhaps understood its magnitude better than anyone else. Their meticulous efforts, their sophisticated analysis, their desperate attempts to penetrate communications they could hear but not comprehend, all failed because they confronted something their training and ideology hadn't prepared them for. Their defeat taught a truth that transcends warfare and cryptography. Some codes are unbreakable not through mathematical complexity that might eventually be solved through sufficient computation, but through human culture's infinite complexity itself, through the irreducible diversity of human experience, language, and knowledge that no single perspective can fully encompass or overcome. The Code Talkers' greatest message wasn't encoded in any specific transmission, wasn't contained in any particular tactical communication, but emerged from their service itself, from what they represented and accomplished. That message remains universal and vital. Diversity brings strength that homogeneity cannot match. Culture brings power that technology alone cannot provide, and indigenous knowledge serves modern purposes in ways that vindicate its preservation and celebration. The young Navajo men who used their sacred language first as a weapon of war and then as an instrument of peace proved forever that America's greatest encryption, its most unbreakable code, its most enduring strength, is diversity itself. This strength proves unbreakable because it emerges from the limitless variety of human experience, wisdom, and capability that free societies embrace and authoritarian societies try to suppress. The unbroken code remains unbroken today, living not in classified documents or museum exhibits, but in every native child speaking an ancestral language with pride and understanding its value. It lives in every recognition that minority contributions don't diminish national strength, but enhance it. It lives in every understanding that our differences, rather than dividing us, make us stronger together when we unite them toward common purpose. The Code Talkers prove that our diversity isn't a problem to be solved or a weakness to be overcome. It's a strength to be celebrated, a resource to be cultivated, and a gift to be cherished as the eternal foundation of freedom itself. Their unbroken code, transmitted across decades from World War II battlefields to the present moment, carries a message as clear today as when Chester Nez first spoke it into his radio on Guadalcanal. Many voices, many peoples, many languages, united in purpose but diverse in identity, create something unbreakable, something precious, something worth defending with everything we possess.